Yeah, thank you, Beth. And thanks, everyone. I'm going to um, provide a presentation now on the Global Agreement for the Conservation and Sustainable Use of Marine Biological Diversity in Areas Beyond National Jurisdiction. This is then commonly referred to as the BBNJ Agreement. I will do my best not to use any acronyms, but I definitely will use BBNJ, so Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction. So I wanted to give you a brief overview of what that actually is, what BBNJ is, talk to you briefly about the negotiations, how those took form. I think that could be interesting from a policy process perspective. Tell you a little bit about what's included in this global agreement, and then tell you some next steps on what's going to take before that enters into force. So yeah, first and foremost, of course, 71% of the planet is covered by the ocean, and 60% of that is considered high seas. So this is a massive area within our blue planet that we're talking about for this global agreement. And areas beyond national jurisdiction, we saw this in Pradeep's presentation, but just to highlight it also here, this is the 200 nautical miles off the coast and includes both the high seas and the area. So what we're speaking about specifically is the biodiversity captured within this legal zone. A bird's eye view shows you here. The light blue is what's included in the high seas or areas beyond national jurisdiction, where white indicates the exclusive economic zone, spotted along all of the continents, coastlines, except Antarctica, and then of course surrounding all islands throughout the ocean. And of course these areas have a number of species, plants, animals, ecosystems from large to small existing within their ocean spaces, and they are contributing to biodiversity. I won't get into it. I'm sure you're all aware of the concept of ecosystem services and how important biodiversity is contributing to our well-being and our livelihoods on this planet. Traditionally, biodiversity within this area has been managed through the mandates and legal regulations of a number of different institutions, organizations, and treaties, but these have always been tasked with specific elements relating to specific sectors like fishing or deep sea mining, or regulated through science and development, but there's no one singular overarching body or framework which allowed states to take action to conserve and protect biodiversity in this area. So building on sort of this momentum of growing awareness of the importance of biodiversity and biodiversity within these areas, states recognized the importance of establishing a global agreement. So the negotiations, let's get into that. This is a picture of the United Nations, Conference Room 2, I believe, where states and observers gathered to negotiate this global treaty. You see here in the front is Ambassador Raina Lee, who was the president over the negotiations. The BBNJ agreement is one of 3 implementing agreements under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS. It's the 3rd one after the implementation of Part 11 from deep sea mining, the UN Fish Stocks Agreement in 1995. And in terms of the timeline, the negotiations officially kicked off with the BBNJ working group meetings in 2006. However, there was, of course, numerous informal discussions taking place many years before that. The BBNJ working groups was a way for experts and organizations to come and participate and propose ideas for how the negotiations should take shape, what kind of topics should be included, or what kind of topics should be excluded. From 2016 to 17 is when preparatory committee meetings took place. This was more of an administrative requirement, where the actual administrative requirements for negotiating such a treaty were discussed within the United Nations before the formal negotiations kicked off in 2018 with IGC 1, or Intergovernmental Conference 1. These took place from 2018 to 2023 and culminated then this year in March with IGC 5.2, and then IGC 5.3, which was a follow-up in June, which was really just to adopt the language and ensure that it was there was a legal scrubbing exercise that took place, and it was adapted into the multiple UN languages. And then, of course, the world celebrated. So you've probably seen this throughout the news. It was quite a historic moment, with media outlets from across the world picking up on this historic language, that the agreement was achieved to protect and conserve biodiversity in the high seas. But let's get into what's actually in the agreement. This is a picture here of state delegates in the final hours of negotiations. I think this was 10 o'clock on a Saturday morning. And I like to show this picture because you see the contradiction, I guess, or the difference between the first picture from the negotiations, everyone organized sitting in a conference room, where in the end it came down to people exchanging and talking in small groups in bilateral meetings throughout the hallways of the United Nations. This picture here shows the Chinese delegation primarily sitting at the center, and a number of delegates surrounding them to discuss whatever topic it was. I'm not entirely sure. So the agreement, what is included in this agreement? It first includes the part 1, which is a preamble and general provisions. And then it includes the 4 package elements, as they're called. This includes marine genetic resources, including the access to benefits and sharing from marine genetic resources. Part 3, which is area-based management tools, including marine protected areas. So these are primarily spatial measures used to conserve and sustainably use the resources in the high seas. Part 4, which is environmental impact assessments. So how to assess the potential significant harm of impacts of new activities that could take place in these areas. Part 5, which is capacity building and technology transfer. So how to support states so that they can actively participate in the future implementation of such agreement. And so these 4, part 2 through part 5, are considered the package elements, which meant that they're negotiated as a whole, that it was not one could not be separated from the rest, but they all needed to be agreed upon together in order for there to be a global treaty. And then the last part is the part 6, institutional arrangements, which is the cross-cutting issues. And then there's a number of smaller parts as well, which I won't get into. Part 1 on the preamble and general provisions, it's important to really note there's sort of a dual competing approach throughout this treaty, throughout the negotiations, and ultimately throughout the treaty text. And that is this first, the issue of not undermining versus shall cooperate. Not undermining refers to the fact that this treaty does not supersede any existing treaty or any potentially upcoming treaties. And that means that there is a requirement to cooperate in order to implement the BBNJ agreement. It includes shall cooperate, so that means countries are obliged, they're legally required to cooperate through this treaty with other existing treaties in order to achieve the goals here. It also includes the principles of the common heritage of humankind, similar to the deep sea mining, but in addition, it includes the freedom of marine scientific research and other freedoms. These are highly important principles that were embedded in the treaty, and some of the key sticking points in which states, particularly from the global south, wanted to ensure this idea of common heritage of humankind was captured. And this was then sort of answered by including the freedom of marine scientific research and other freedoms. In regard to part 2, marine genetic resources, these are marine genetic resources. These types of resources are those included in pharmaceutical products or cosmetics or any other type of product which might be taken from genetic material captured or collected within the high seas. This also includes digital sequence information within the treaty. However, it does not apply to fishing or fish caught through other related activities. This was one of the most difficult parts of the treaty to negotiate, particularly in regard to monetary benefits. It includes non-monetary benefits that will be shared through the treaty. This is in regard to learning exchanges or shared cruises, but it also includes monetary benefits for the conservation. Oh, I think we have a new participant. Okay.
Yeah, a reminder to all participants to please mute the microphones.
Okay, sorry about that. So it also includes monetary benefits within the treaty, in which a means to distribute the financial benefits stemming from these resources to be distributed through an established fund to those states participating. These funds will go for the conservation and sustainable use of marine biological diversity, so for the objectives of the treaty. In terms of part 3, measures, area-based management measures in other marine protected areas. As I mentioned, this is the primarily element for the conservation and sustainable use. The treaty sets out a process for making and submitting measures. It sets out also rules to facilitate consultations through the scientific and technical body, and for states to gather input from other states. Ultimately, in terms of decision-making, it is the Conference of the Party that will take decisions on whether or not area-based management tools or marine protected areas shall be established within the high seas. If a consensus is not reached within the Conference of the Parties, a 3/4 majority can be used to achieve consensus. This is very important. It's a strong win for the conservation community, in the sense that it does not allow any one state to veto or block the establishment of a marine protected area or an area-based management tool within the high seas. However, there is an opt-out clause, which means that states can choose to not participate in an area-based management tool or marine protected area if they provide explanation on the grounds of their objection. However, they are then required then to start to take measures to ultimately participate in that area-based management tool. The part 4, which is environmental impact assessments. This sets out also a process by which states, it's going to be a state-driven process, shall conduct environmental impact assessments for activities that will be conducted both within areas of national jurisdiction and beyond. So that's very important because it includes activities within state jurisdictions, but that might have a potential impact on areas beyond national jurisdiction. It sets forth a process by which states have to collect and submit their information to the COP and allows states to propose comments and suggestions on those assessments, and then ultimately requires that those environmental impact assessment reports are collected and submitted and made public. In the decision-making on environmental impact assessment lies within the state's responsibility. However, again, states are allowed to suggest mitigation or management measures, and the Conference of the Parties may provide advice and assistance on those measures. The final element was in regard to cooperation in capacity building and transfer of marine technology. This was probably the least contentious point of negotiation. It does set forth the obligation that states shall cooperate to assist parties, particularly in developing state parties, to achieve the objectives of this agreement. So this also includes an annex in which an indicative list of opportunities for capacity building and marine technology transfer are included in the agreement. Last but not least is part 6. This includes the institutional arrangements, which sets forth the rules for participation in the Conference of the Parties. It includes a scientific and technical body, which will be tasked with providing advice and scientific oversight into the COP, the Conference of the Parties, and the implementation of the agreement. It also includes the establishment of a secretariat, which will be tasked with administrative functions and coordinating and organizing those requirements of the future treaty. And it also includes the establishment of a clearinghouse mechanism, which is more or less going to be some kind of data repository in which data or information, including assessment reports, such as in regard to the environmental impact assessments, would be gathered and made public through this mechanism. So, what are the next steps for the treaty? First, it will be open for signature by states on the 20th of September. So that's just in a week or so. So pay attention. That means states will have the opportunity to start following up at a national level. Of course, states will then be required to follow their national rules and procedures to accept and ultimately sign the treaty and transpose it into their national law. The treaty itself enters into force once 60 states have ratified the treaty, plus a 120-day wait period. 60 may seem like an arbitrary number, but of course there were states pushing that wanted to see the treaty enter into force sooner. Were pushing for 30, while some states that were suggesting more time would be needed were pushing for numbers such as 90 or 120. I believe personally, though, of course, it will be important. The success of this future treaty will be also determined by the number of states that participate. If we only have a limited number of countries participating, I think this takes away from the bite of the agreement. And there's already preparation for the first COP in terms of preliminary discussions have already been started. And there's also discussions of establishing an interim secretariat and other bodies and committees to begin preparing for the treaty once it enters into force. So how can you get involved? I won't go into a lot of detail here. I think this was really covered in significant detail in some of the discussions yesterday, and I think also in Pradeep's presentation. And I have the impression that a lot of those ideas can be really transferred also into the future BBNJ implementation. But in particular in this, in regard to the BBNJ agreement, as this is really in a preparatory phase, I think all actors are really going to need to start gearing up and determining what role they can have and what role they can take both in the preparation and in the future implementation. So one thing states can start to do is hosting national dialogues between ministries, civil society, the scientific community to begin to raise awareness about this treaty, but also to identify, okay, which ministry is going to take the lead? How are we going to divide responsibilities? Because given the integrated and holistic perspective that this treaty takes, it will be important that there's a lot of cross collaboration between ministries. So those types of dialogues can already start to take place prior to it entering into force. And such is also I think really important for relevant organizations, whether that's sectoral or from civil society, starting to gear up their actions as to how, what role they can play at a national or regional level to advise and participate in the implementation of the treaty. This also, there's also obviously a very strong role from the research community, asking the question, okay, what science is needed for the agreement? Where are there gaps? And how can we start to fill in some of those gaps and answer some of the questions in terms of science, but also in terms of indigenous and traditional knowledge that will be important for the future treaty, knowing now what is coming. But I think also in terms of individuals, there's also an opportunity to start to build a network, start to engage even within your university or in your organization to start to put together perhaps a BBNJ informal group, get together people that are also interested and exchange and try to build on the momentum that is coming as a small group. I think there's really a lot of opportunity to take shape. So my final messages to take you home with is that this treaty is really historic and we should celebrate. It's not perfect. I think those of us that have been involved with it for a number of years recognize that a lot of the hard decisions about what to be included or excluded from the treaty have actually been kicked down to the Conference of the Parties or the first scientific and technical board to be sorted out later. But of course, it's a huge win that we have this treaty in place and hopes that many of these hard discussions will take shape quickly in the first COP or the second COP. If you dive into the text itself, you'll maybe recognize that much of the treaty is maybe considered vague, although this might also be considered constructively ambiguous. Ultimately, it provides a framework to act, but it's not a solution. So it's really going to be up to states to take this framework and put it into place to make it a successful treaty. Also, of course, just to mention again, the issues of not undermining versus the need for collaboration, as well as the principles of common heritage of humankind and the freedom of high seas are really sort of dual perspectives on the treaty, which are just covered throughout all of the articles and all of the text, which will be very interesting over the future years to see how they influence and how the treaty takes shape. So I see some hands already, so I will stop my presentation there. Thank you very much for listening. I hope I didn't take too much time.